5 o'clock. I'd like to call the meeting to order, the special meeting of Tuesday, December 19th, 2023, for the tri-board? Bi-board. And we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance, please. The flag is behind the screen for anyone that can't see it.
I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, with that being said, welcome everyone, thank you. Wendy and Heather will be here shortly, but without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Lee to start us off, please.
Thank you very much, Steve. Options and our recommendations. So, Russ?
Thanks, Lee. And thank all of you. I appreciate the time you all put in for the town as well. What we're here to discuss tonight is SVAA and the running of a second response unit. So historically, we ran one ambulance 24/7. It is ALS, so paramedic service. More recently, for the last year and a half or so, we've been running a second daytime unit, so a unit staffed for a 12-hour day shift that we thought made sense to run because of call volumes, and I'll get into that in a minute. And we've been able to do so with the help of the town. Last summer, we received a $150,000 grant with $75,000 allocated to 2023, $75,000 allocated to 2024 to keep the second unit fully staffed and running that 12-hour day shift through June 30th of 24. So what we'd like to discuss now is financing beyond that date if the town desires for that unit to continue running, and that is something we would recommend. The reason we don't run it or haven't been running it more than that is basically it is not fiscally sustainable. So what this slide shows is basically the operational costs of an ambulance for a 12-hour shift, 365 days a year. It's basically $350,000 in annual operating costs. The state sets the amount we are allowed to bill per call, depending on the type of call. That gross billing totals $384,000. So normally you'd shut the book and say we should be in pretty good shape. Unfortunately, about 65% of our calls are either Medicaid or Medicare, which do not pay anywhere near what the state allows us to bill. So as a result, on that $384,000 of gross billing, what we are allowed to collect is about $200,000, and we net collect $173,000 of that, which is between 85 and 90% of what's allowed. So our collection rate is pretty good, but it leaves us with a deficit of about $175,000 a year to run the ambulance, and that's exactly what the town contributed with the grant last year. The good news, I would say, is we are projecting call volumes to go up, and again, the reason we originally started running a second unit is back in 2014. We recognize that mutual aid in calls. So if we're not available, we have mutual aid with Granby and Canton. They will send an available ambulance if we needed a second ambulance. Similarly, if they need an ambulance, we send an ambulance to their town. But so back in 14, we discovered we there was a need. We thought the town would benefit from running a second unit. We started doing so as we could afford to from either a fiscal or staffing levels. So post-COVID, we talked to the town, and again, agreed that it made sense to run the second unit, but we needed the staffing. We're projecting the call volumes that have been growing to keep growing, and if they do, what this chart basically shows you is that second unit's deficit bottoms out somewhere in the next year or so, and then we would expect the revenues to basically catch up with the expenses somewhere around 2027, 2028 for that unit. I'm just going to skip through, and I hope you've had a chance to look at the deck. I'm not going to go through every page because I think we're pretty limited on time. So from an operational standpoint, I think, what we're looking for is help in the next few years with the idea in 5 years or so, the operational side will be able to take care of itself again. There's also a capital side. The cost of ambulances has gone up quite a bit after COVID. Right now, a new unit, and while we're running 2 units, 2 units during the day, we do have a third ambulance. So we have an availability of units to try and make sure we can keep 2 on the road, whether, for servicing or other reasons, we have to take 1 off. But a new ambulance costs right now about $400,000. Prior to COVID, that was closer to $325,000. And, it remains to be seen, when that supply chain picks up. Right now, I think the wait for a new ambulance is a year or 2. But anyway, from a capital budgeting side, we anticipate about every 3rd year having to replace one of the 3 units. So from a capital side, again, it would be about a $400,000 expense every 3rd year. And just quickly to kind of walk through, exactly what we're looking for is right now, as I mentioned, we started running the second unit, talked to the town about it, and the idea is the unit right now is we think, going out on about, call it 1.2 calls a day. So essentially, it's getting 9 calls a week. Of those 9 calls, about 65% are going to be transports. So 3 of the calls will be refusals. We generally collect no revenue on a refusal. So we have 6 transports we're doing. And the idea of the second ambulance wasn't so much just to have to be able to do 1 call a day, if you will. It was really what happens in EMS for whatever reason is the 911 calls come in sporadically. And what we really wanted was the second unit to be able to handle the cluster of calls. So when we get 2 or 3 911 calls in the same hour, that we weren't totally reliant on mutual aid for those, and we'd have a second unit in town available to go. And, so that's why we started running it. We do think it's important. As far as the time of day for calls, generally 2/3 of our call, or maybe a little more than that, are during the day hours, so call it 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. The overnight, we only get about 1/3 of the calls, and given the fiscal constraints we've been operating under, which is basically our historic model is billing, as we talked about earlier, for what we can, running some collection drives, getting grant money where we can. But, as I say, the second daytime unit isn't fiscally sustainable. If we ran a second nighttime unit, which we could do from a staffing perspective, we are fully staffed, which is a little unusual these days in EMS. There is a shortage of workers, but we could do it. We're not recommending that right now, but if it's something the town desired, we would expect that unit to have about 1/3 of the calls of that daytime. So instead of 6 transports a week, it might do 2 or 3 transports at night would be what we anticipated. The cost for a second, for a nighttime unit would be that much higher. I think it's around about 280,000 net of the revenue. So that's, really what we're going to be looking for the town is, one, do you want us to continue running after June the second daytime unit? And if so, we'd be looking for the support, which again, we can go through the budgets in more detail, and I'll let Amy talk about some of her analysis on that. But, for next year, it would be somewhere the operational side would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000, $275,000, depending on how the numbers and the calls fall out. And then, reducing itself till about 2027, 2028 period, where we think the operations would be back to neutral given the call volume. And then a continued ask again on the capital side for about $400,000 every 3 to 4 years, depending on the mileage basically that goes on the ambulances. And I'll stop there and,
Thank you very much, Russ. We prefer that members of the boards hold their questions till we finish the presentation. And I think we're on schedule. So Amy was asked to do a thorough financial review, which is done. She's going to present that.
So in your packet, does everybody have a packet? Do you want me to put it up on the screen? Put it up? Okay. 1 second. Oh, it's not gonna let me. Okay. Is that big enough? Okay. So as Lee mentioned, I was tasked with reviewing their audited financial statements and their 990s over the last several years. So we went back to 2012, and Russ and I collaborated on projections through 2027. I think these 3 charts probably show the best. They clearly illustrate the position that they've been in and kind of where we are anticipating them to be going. So that first chart, you'll see that the total expenses line is in orange, and then the total revenue line is in blue. So typically for a sustainable model, we would want that blue to be above that orange. But as you can see, since 2012, the expenditures have exceeded the revenues. So through 2027 is where they start to meet if the revenue projections come to fruition. If they don't, then they'll still continue on a negative course. So you can see on this chart, there was 1 year where they did not have a loss, I believe is in 2020. And then this brings us down to our next chart, which shows their net assets. So in continuation, loss after loss, you're going to eat into your reserves, you're going to eat into your net assets. So we started strong in 2012, and then as we go down the projections through 2027, the reserves start to go away. And then the next chart, which I think is probably the most important, this is just a trend line, but right here you can see with the blue line, it shows what their cash flow has been. So you'll see it's around 50,000 starting in 2012. We go up. We had a lot of investments, a lot of investment income, but as we are eating into the reserves for our losses, our cash is going down, our investments are being depleted, and eventually getting into 2027, you can see that it becomes into a negative cash position just based on the way the expenditures and the revenues are flowing. So based on this chart, it's about 2025 that they'll hit a negative cash position. So at this point, without any changes to their model, they could be classified as a going concern. I did it as part of the.
Oh, you did?
Yep.
Okay. So now we're going to talk briefly about the theoretical options that we generated. And I'm just going to talk from the summary of those options. And those options are in priority order.
Do you want me to bring them up?
Please. Yep. So option number 1 is continue SVAA as a private nonprofit entity. We feel that is the most cost-effective option for the short term. Second is a regional private nonprofit entity of some sort. That's a longer-term option, but we think there is potential there. And the advantage of that is the administrative costs and perhaps the capital costs can be spread out among a larger base of communities. The third option, which is also a longer-term option and may not make much sense, is a special act, special taxing district. I was not able to find any written materials on how that is created, but I imagine it's with some research, a bill is written and the bill is introduced by one of our representatives or our either our representative or our senator, and through a long legislative process, it gets passed. I think it's probably been a long time since a special act, special taxing district has been created. And it may not make sense in our situation because, we're talking 1/10 of a mil, something like that, to raise. So it may not make sense to go through all of that work. We did a series of pros and cons on the 10 options, and I'll let you read those at your leisure. Our recommendations, short term, being defined as the balance of this fiscal year. We need to negotiate a successor MOU to the one that was put in place in the fall. And Karen suggested maybe that should be a contract instead of an MOU. So that's something to think about. And that MOU or contract should clearly define the expectations and the level of service based upon the need. And we would recommend that that be based on a recommendation from the SVAA. And as Russ indicated earlier, they do not feel they're at a point where they can recommend a second ambulance in the evening. That will probably come in the future as calls for service increase. We believe it would be helpful to provide some pro bono technical assistance to the SVAA on increasing donations and volunteers, which have been declining in recent years. We believe the SVAA should conduct an annual assessment of the level of service needed and communicate that to both the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance. And then we'd recommend that SVAA should identify a progression of service enhancements needed over time in order to educate the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance, and the public what to expect in the future as the call volume increases. Short-term next fiscal year, we're without recommending a specific dollar amount or a mix of assistance, we believe that providing operating assistance as needed, pay off the current ambulance loans as needed. Those loans are at the rate of 5.75 and 6.75%. That'd provide some relief. Provide funds for ambulance replacements through the CNR as needed. And then continue to provide pro bono technical assistance. The intermediate term over the next 2 to 3 years, provide funds for ambulance replacement as needed and operating assistance and pro bono technical assistance. And then longer term, we do believe it's worth exploring the feasibility of a regional private nonprofit EMS provider or a special act, special taxing district, and hopefully one of those strategies would be agreed upon by the SVAA and the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance together. So that completes our presentation. I think we did it under 20 minutes, and
we'd be happy to take questions and provide answers as best we can.
Yeah, I'm sorry I'm late. Both of us come from the east side of town and got hung up, and one of the other river entrances was closed today, which we didn't expect. So I want to apologize. Oh, that's okay. So we have two boards here. We have the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance here. I don't know, has everybody been introduced before we got here? Okay, would you guys, let's start over here and introduce ourselves, Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance. Oh, sure, well, yeah, sure. I think everybody knows those guys, but we can.
Yeah, that's okay, yeah.
All right, I'm Curtis Looney, Board of Selectmen.
You know Mark? Mark, you everybody know you?
Hi, everybody. Mark Nelson, incoming town manager.
Other guys, Board of Selectmen? I think next to you is Board of Selectmen.
Stephen Antonio, Board of Selectmen.
Diana Geisley, Board of Selectmen.
Different deal.
I'm Sharon.
Not here, this is the Board of Finance side.
Bert Helf, I'm from the Board of Finance.
Lisa Hefner.
Art House.
You guys all introduce yourselves.
We can. Chris Kelly.
Brian Clancy.
Russ Regenauer.
Karen Stewart.
Mark Mallon.
Okay, so I did check with Lee before this and asked to make sure how I got to handle this, and since we have two boards here, I'd like to do this in some sort of orderly fashion, rather than just call things out. So if you want to speak, and I can recognize you to speak, or I can go around the room and see who has questions. That's kind of how we've been handling it. So why don't we alternate, unless somebody wants to raise their hand, I think we can just alternate our questions. So I don't want to put anybody on the spot. So who on our side has a question to kick off? Diana.
So I have a question about the the slide on the salaries and compensation benefits compared to peers. So if we can pull that slide out.
Yes, on our part.
Out of those other peer towns listed, which of and how many of those are our mutual aid towns that we co-service with?
Just the one, just Granby. on the
Just
list.
Granby. So then a question would be, is it something that we should look at, the salaries and compensation and employee benefits of those that we have mutual aid with rather than towns that we don't have mutual aid with? Or are these towns chosen because they're an equal service area size and like how are these chosen versus those that we do mutual aid with?
So I chose them on the basis of they're within our region, and then they're of a similar size on a revenue standpoint. So north of 900,000 in annual revenues, and so they line up as peers. We have deeper data if you want to. So it's something we could do a deeper dive if need be. But it seemed like these were the most relevant in terms of size and having similar demographics and regional characteristics.
Do you have data on them, on the towns just comparable? I mean, I understand it could be wind up comparing apples to oranges.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Those that we do mutual aid with.
Yeah.
Because I know that ultimately affects, the service that we have.
Yeah, so we could provide that. So what I use is Cause IQ. It's the 990 data.
Mm-hmm.
That's readily accessible. And so, I can certainly provide my cut of it, but if you have any towns you would like included, we can certainly do that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, let's go right now.
I want to jump in because very similar to Diana's question. On page 30, there's a comparison, another peer group comparison between net profits of different towns. And some people that don't stand out so far from the rest of them. Is their model different? Why are they so different from everybody else?
So Suffield, we were talking a bit about this before the meeting. So So there's more in the way of donor-advised funds, and it kind of comes down to more two families, it seems, within Suffield have made it their cause really to support with their own personal wealth. And so they've been very, very generous in terms of annual support to the town. And then on the expense side in Suffield, Karen was mentioning that the town does pick up some of the expenses.
And actually, that, last year it was $369,000 that the town of Suffield funded to the Ambulance Association.
I have a few questions, but just to add on to that, Suffield, they also seem to leverage government grants with grant writing better than a number of the other ones did. I think it was over $50,000 that they're getting in government grants. As well as their compensation is lower, so are they relying more heavily on volunteers where that's where you're seeing such a huge cost? Are they doing something to attract more in terms of local volunteers?
Yeah, in terms of the number of employees, it's the granularity around that data and who's getting paid and who's not. They're roughly in the same ballpark in terms of number of employees, but from an expense standpoint, because some of the expense is on the town ledger rather than on the ambulance, it's not really apples to apples.
So that's not showing, their compensation really isn't real compensation?
It doesn't flow through the way ours does.
Yeah.
And is there a way for us to leverage government grant writing? Do we have anyone who has that ability to do that?
We do, and we've pursued some grants. They're very few and far between, unfortunately, for EMS. And it's also more for capital, smaller capital items. And to be honest, finding a grant for something specific is harder for us to do, but we certainly can pursue some more. We did actually this year get a couple of them that were passed through. So, but it still doesn't pay for an ambulance. I don't think we'll ever get a grant for an ambulance. So.
Going back to the very lovely projection, your projection, was the impact of the pending building projects, where there's going to be about probably an 8% increase in our population, included in those projections, considered in those projections?
No. And it's actually, I think historically, when the planning on the town side's been done, EMS hasn't been involved. But what we looked at is, looking back to roughly 2016 and going forward from there. And that's when we've seen, some of the recent building in town. We've on average grown by, our call volume has grown by about 4% a year. So that's what we're projecting is a kind of a smooth 4% going out. The other thing I'd throw in is on those projections, I did the simple standard deviation of year to year to see what, the differential could be in our possible billing. And so on that one standard deviation of our calls year to year is about 220 calls, which would translate to roughly 85,000 in revenue, expected revenue. So that's, year to year when we put all these plans together, that's kind of the plus minus we're trying to get inside of.
I think just to follow up with the projections, I was looking at it, and if the number of volunteers, it's going down, is that correct?
It's been going down for 20 years, and it's not local to us. It's a state and national issue. It's just, speaking as someone, I've been volunteering for about 15 years. And when I started, it was hard to find a night to get on to volunteer because we had enough volunteers to do that. But over the years, again, just volunteering in general has gone down. There's a very high commitment when you volunteer for the ambulance. You have to sign up for a regular shift, and we require minimum hours every month because you need to keep your skill set up. And so between the growing call volumes, so the fact you're sleeping less at night, and, you know, most of the volunteers have day jobs, the amount of training involved, EMS does a hell of a lot more now than it did 15 years ago when I started. So that's more training as well, that it's just, yeah, volunteer numbers have shrunk. And honestly, I'm not sure what would turn that around. And again, we're in a very fortunate situation. Looking around, again, the country and the state, there's a shortage of EMS workers. We've been able to fully staff the organization to run that second unit. And again, if the town ever desired they want it run more than it's being run, we can staff for that. But we've done that through, you know, growing, you know, being a positive environment for our employees, which is one of the things I didn't mention in the beginning, is we really are going to need an answer on whether the town wants to fund the second unit and is willing to commit to it financially by the end of March, because come June, we don't want to be in a situation where we have to tell our employees, sorry, next month you're not scheduled to come on because we're cutting back. We're going to give our employees what we think is a fair notice. And unfortunately, when we negotiated last year, when we got to January of this year, you know, we were asked to keep running the unit with the idea that funding would come, and ultimately it did. We're very appreciative of the $150,000, but that came 6 months later, and we're told that the first 6 months was on us, which basically meant the reserves we had are now pretty much dwindled. And so June 30 will be a hard deadline for running the second ambulance, and we're unfortunately going to have an end of March hard deadline to know if we're getting funding or not for it, so we can give our employees a, you know, what we think is fair treatment if we have to staff back. We're hoping it doesn't go to that, by the way.
Sure thing, just 2 more points. In the forecasting, does any of the Yukon Health and the smaller clinics that are put in town, does that alleviate any of the pressure on the ambulance, people go to walk maybe more? And then if we're reducing the amount of volunteers, how do we get to even 20%? You know, the costs are going
Yep.
up, the population's getting older.
Yeah, so it really is, it's all about the projected call volume. And again, we're growing that at 4% a year, which seems to be pretty consistent with the last 7 or 8 years, what we've seen in town. And we bill for revenue. So, you know, running that ambulance for 12 hours every day, it's going to cost us $350,000. That's the cost. The revenue side's just dependent on how many calls it gets. And as I said, right now, it's doing roughly 6 transports, so not quite 1 transport a day. And we think by 2027 or so, it'll be doing enough transports per day to support itself from an operational standpoint.
With the aging population, are there more Medicare costs? I mean, so those are going to get paid less. So are we factoring that into a reduced revenue, or?
Yeah, so we're on that front, we average just under $600 of revenue per transport. We're actually assuming that number grows by about 2% a year, and we're assuming our expenses grow by 3% a year. That's what's in the budget numbers.
Thank you for coming. My understanding, this is a macro question, is that we're not voting on action tonight. We're giving information.
Yep.
The ambulance has an excellent reputation. You've done a terrific job in town. And what I understand that's happened is you've done the right thing. You're looking down the road and seeing these numbers that financially we have to do something, otherwise we will not be able to keep up with this service, and we may need more equipment. And we have to have an ambulance service in Simsbury. So this is, I think, all very, very healthy. If you could help me, and I say this in honest ignorance, I am not familiar with other issues related to this. It seems straightforward to me. We've got an ambulance service, does a great job. It needs some financial arrangement going into the future to ensure that. I've received some vituperative or what, vitriolic letters on the side. You see them in ignorance, I don't know the background to them, and I do not want to get into who struck John, what the counterpoint is, but could you just characterize, are there any other relevant issues surrounding this ought to come before this group? And if so, just could you say what they are, just to fulfill the tableau so we know what we're considering?
So, yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. You know, I guess I'll step back and just talk about, you know, again, from the board perspective, what we've looked at is, you know, and again, being a volunteer, you understand the service that's being provided, and it is a critical service, although the state doesn't define it as that. So, you know, from a high level, the town is required to provide an ambulance service to its citizens, but it's not required to pay for it. Historically, we were able to do that, right? We, you know, going back to 2000, 2010, call volumes were at where we could run one ambulance, and we could still run one ambulance and remain solvent long-term, right? But to the point, the call volumes are growing. The average person doesn't understand the triage system, and so depending, when you call 911, you know, one of the slides here does point out what happens. There'll immediately be, the police are the first responder, right? So we're at base central town. We're in a big ambulance. You don't go real fast, and, you know, for safety reasons. So the first responder gets there. They can handle a lot of immediate emergencies while we get there. Our typical response time, lights and sirens, so for a critical call in town is a little under 7 minutes. If you call in and it's a non-urgent, so not a lights and sirens call, you need to go to the hospital, something's going on. That's a cold response. If we're going to see you and an emergency call and something more critical on a triage level comes into the 911 dispatcher, we'll get rerouted. A second ambulance will start coming to you. If the second ambulance is in town, again, you can look for something like, you know, 6 to 8 minute response. If it's coming from out of town, it's probably more like a 15-minute response. But that's kind of the way the system's set up. And again, what we're asking for and recommending is that we do run that second ambulance, especially during the daytime hours, again, to kind of cover when we get these clusters of calls that are going to stretch the mutual aid system that we rely on, and just, you know, to have more preparedness.
That's very educational, very helpful, and I applaud the work. Is that what the controversy is about?
The controversies go to, so everyone's going to have an opinion. So we could staff, let's say we do the 2, right? And you get 3 critical calls for some reason within an hour. So the first person gets help 6 to 8 minutes, second person gets help 6 to 8 minutes, the third person 15 minutes, right? That could make a difference, right? And if you're the person waiting 15 minutes, or if it's a non-critical call and we're coming back from Hartford Hospital, you might wait a half hour. You know, there can be prolonged delays depending on the availability of ambulances. The problem with running down this logic is, at some point you have to decide what your constraint is. For us, it's always been our budget, right? That $1 million budget or $800,000 budget. For the town, you have to decide, you know, I'd say it's public safety, so there's a critical need for it, but, you know, it's kind of goes along, why don't you have, you know, 10 kids to a classroom, right? At some point, there's a fiscal constraint to what you can provide. And frankly, we could run 3 or 4 ambulances, and you'd always have the possibility that there's that next call.
I see, so the controversy is that perhaps there should be even greater services. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Art, if I could just add, any concern that's expressed operationally has been vetted in this report, right? You know, quality of response time, benchmarking against other communities, cost of employees, et cetera. So I think this report, if you really dig into the quality of operational management, can speak to any of those areas of concerns. I think the report validates that we provide better than average service at less than average cost. It's a phrase that people have heard me speak to before. In the 2 years I've been on the association, 4 times the community have come to us and asked us to evaluate a specific response because there's been concerns expressed by members of the community, and all 4 of those we've given detailed responses, and I think in all 4 of those situations the response was very good. So I think these concerns that people express are legitimate ones that any organization should benchmark themselves against. I think the answers actually are in good faith and due diligence in the data here.
Thank you, Chris. That clarifies, I appreciate it.
I've got a naive question. I'm just coming up to speed on this, it's only been a week. As I understand it, because I'm learning about the billing practices, if transport is refused, no money is billable. What's to stop as our aging population continues? I'm not gonna name any particular establishment, but the default seems to be call EMS, because they wanna cover their, can I say ASS?
Say it that way.
CYA, yes.
I think, to be honest, if that's the default in this litigious society, it's actually gonna accelerate. Is there anything that we or you could do to turn those non-billable automatic trips to just curtail them a little bit? Is there anything you're aware of another ambulance organization does? Because I'm worried that that's also gonna escalate the problem with non-billables.
Are you talking about out of facilities or from residential clients?
Facilities.
There's not a whole heck of a lot we can do for the facilities. And unfortunately, being 911, we can't turn it down. They do have a non-emergent system where they're able to call a commercial service and schedule a transport when it's a non-emergent thing. But they don't often do that because they're overworked, and the easiest thing to do is to pick up and call 911. So you get the ball rolling, and we have no choice but to go. And so we have to transport the patients. Those usually aren't our refusals. Refusals are usually for private residents.
So, all right, that pretty much answers it. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And we do have the ability to bill for some refusals. It's not our favorite thing to do, but the state has allowed us in the past year to go to someone's home, render care, and if they feel like that they could stay home, we have the ability to bill a certain amount. Unfortunately, insurance and Medicare doesn't want to pay for that right now. So it's been a hard decision to bill private residents for that, but we do need to do that in terms of income. It does cost us something to go to someone's house to do that.
So is that your decision to make? I apologize for cutting you off. Whether to bill them, is that something that SVAA actually?
It's rules.
It's rules. We can't pick and choose who we bill, basically, yeah, so.
Where are those rules?
So the state allows us to do that, so every year we get a rate for what's billable in terms of what's a paramedic level service, a BLS service, and then this past year, they gave us a rate amount for a BLS level treat and non-transport and a paramedic level treat and non-transport.
Yeah, so on that call, we'd have to do certain things for it to qualify. And then, one of the things historically, not that we could bill for it, but one of the things we always talked about is, do you want to take the chance if you have an older person who is falling a lot, right? We do a lot of lifts assist in the middle of the night, to get to the point where they don't call, right? So they choose to stay on the ground for 12 hours till, we do get a lot of those calls too. The person fell and they couldn't call. And they're, as a provider, you definitely don't want to see that. So it's kind of a two-edged sword. It doesn't look like it's going to be a big revenue maker. But yeah, it's possible it could raise a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Any more on that board of finance side?
Can we give Art and the other Art a chance to speak?
Yes, it could be a naive question, but you make an assumption on the increase in revenues, and I think you said an inflation assumption. How are you guys getting at that? Inflation being so high, and medical inflation in particular, it seemed like a really low number.
Yeah, inflation has been coming down, as Jay Powell would say, but
Stop going up.
Well, if it doesn't go up, it's zero, so that's good. But, no, we looked around at I think what some of the town budgeting had assumed, and I think they were using a 3%. And then to be conservative, we just picked a revenue growth number that was less than that. I do think Medicare is in the process of looking at what they're paying out, so we're hopeful that there might be a bump there. But yeah, it's, originally when we did the budget, we kept everything static just so we'd have a good read of what was affecting what, if you will, and then put in some sort of growth assumption.
Does any of that create a constraint on how much you can raise your charge rate, or how does that work?
The state defines,
That's completely, okay.
yeah.
Got it.
So, the town has a responsibility to provide the service, like you said, and it's my understanding that a previous, board had passed on that SRA, I guess, right, to the ambulance. Can you talk about why that's important for you to have, or whether the town should, take that responsibility back on? Could you speak to that a little bit from your perspective?
You're talking about the PSA?
Yeah, PSA, I'm sorry.
Basically, the PSA is owned by Simsbury Volunteer Ambulance. The idea being that it kept both the BLS level and the paramedic level service within our association to provide the service. There has been some suggestion that it be reverted to the town. Should that be something that the town wants to pursue, it's usually turned over to a town based on negligence on the part of the ambulance service, and it would have to be a long, drawn-out case if we weren't participating in it. I honestly think it's best interest for us to hold on to it, but if you took it over, you'd be able to contract with us or another commercial service. And I'm not sure Lee mentioned it, but the price that we got for another private service was $600,000 to $700,000 a year.
Right.
So we like to think we're the least expensive way to do that. I guess it would be something that the town would have to decide if that's really what they want to do and work it out with the association. But I honestly think it's in the better interest of the town for us to take care of it for
So
you.
that's kind of what I'm getting into, and I don't think that we're in a position at the moment where we're talking about clawing
Right.
something back. I'm just wondering, why is it? Could you expound on why it's better for the ambulance to hold that versus the town?
I didn't know the town could hold it without the state.
So an emergency service would have to actually hold it, so it'd have to be
Yeah.
the police department.
Okay.
And I'm not sure, Nick, do you want to take over the PSA back there? So that would have to be transferred to that type of service as opposed to the town, so.
Sorry, I have one question, and I'll switch over to you guys. So you mentioned the short term, in the EMS recommendations, the short term, and you mentioned, taking out loans for the ambulances at certain rates. What is that amount? Is that listed anywhere in here, and how much would that be if we were to take those loans out?
Currently, it's about 170,000. I think we have two loans, one with Liberty and one with Northwest Savings. And I did write it down here, hang on one second. There's 123,000 with Northwest and about 55,000 with Liberty. Those are for the two remounts.
So those would be annual payments that we would ask about?
That would be the payoff of the amount.
Oh, the payoff.
Payoff, that would clear those loans up completely.
And just, I did have another question about, I know there's a lot of talk, and I'm not sure anymore if the state, it comes up in CCM and Prague about higher Medicaid reimbursement rates, and all the towns across the state are fighting and want that. Does that would help you guys a little bit, right, if that ever gets enacted?
So Medicaid is the smallest probably payer that we have. It would help, obviously, we would welcome anything, but it wouldn't make a huge difference in our reimbursement rates.
You asked, thank you, you asked the question I was going to ask about debt, but while I have the floor, Russ, thanks very much, and thank you for the presentation. I'm in the middle of negotiating this exact issue with the city of Poughkeepsie, and it's the same issue throughout New York that it is in Connecticut. Just a couple of quick questions. One is, do you track your average time to service, return to service, if you've got a transport, say, to Hartford Hospital? Are you experiencing the same thing we are in New York, where you're not able to release from that call because of what's happening in the ERs in the state of Connecticut? Is that an issue for you at all?
It is.
It is?
It is.
Are you seeing that return to service time increase dramatically?
It actually leveled off after COVID. It was horrible during COVID.
Yeah.
It takes us about an hour 20 minutes to do a full call from our town to a hospital and back.
I mean, that's okay if you're getting 1.5 or 2 calls a day.
Correct.
Not okay if you're getting 5 or 6 calls.
Yeah, so we actually updated our software too, and the hospitals are much more lenient about relieving PCRs. We used to have to stay at the hospital and actually leave it behind. Now we can fax it to them later on, which reduces our turnaround time. So we've done everything we can to get in and out of those hospitals as quickly as
Do you
possible.
mind sharing with us what your software is?
It's ESO is the company.
Okay, and then last question, so I'm still having a little bit of trouble, although I think I get it after a question from a Board of Finance member. You know, I'm troubled about the estimation that everything will be a little better in 6 or 7 years. That seems a little optimistic, partly because the 4% is low, I believe was a point that was made earlier, but I'll tell you why I think this, because you're essentially doing an analysis based on the ambulance, and you're saying that the second ambulance is not going to be up to the point where its marginal revenue equals its marginal cost until your number of calls increase. But the problem is that around America, in cities that have no lack of calls, their ambulance services are still losing hundreds of thousands, if not millions. In other words, if you look at bigger cities where call volume is not an issue, and you analyze it per call, every single call is losing money. So if I look at it per call, even with the increased call volume that you're projecting, I'm not quite understanding why we think everything is going to be good in 7 years. Can you just help me focus on that issue for a little bit? Keeping in mind my experiences in a bigger city that has 5 ambulances and no lack of call.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really just the math and our empirical experience, which has been, we've been, collecting roughly $600 a call for, 5, 6, 7 years. And, the call volume has been growing, and that's directly proportional. As long as we have the ambulance in reserve that we can send out, we'll collect a piece of that. I think that's the other thing, if we went to the one ambulance model, pretty sure we're maxed out on that front of what we're gonna take in, because we're not gonna hit more calls in a day.
I agree.
Yeah.
I completely agree, me too. What I'm concerned with is that your report is indicating the call volume is already increasing. But as it's increasing, your reserves are decreasing.
Yes, and, all right, I'm with you. And that's an excellent point. And, what Amy showed in the beginning was, back in 2012 or 13, there was a very big reserve. But even back then, we were looking at the town and saying, look, at times, if we have the staffing, because we were staffing for one unit, if you will, but we would have medics and EMTs with availability, we would throw the second unit on the road because we thought it was a good thing to do. And that's the reason the reserves came down. And going back to last year, that 6-month window that we ended up paying for really kind of knocked the end of our reserves out, which is, again, why we're so concerned about this year going forward and really looking for a determination if the town does want the second unit. It needs to commit to it. And again, going back to our ability to staff has been because we think we treat our employees pretty well. We actually pay a little bit less than the commercial services, but we have not had any issues with attracting and maintaining staff. So one of the reasons that's true is we treat them, we think, very fairly. And so.
And I've heard that, and it's a wonderful service. It really is. Last question. On the mutual aid, is there some sense that you could share with us that it's a equitable mutual aid? If this issue in Poughkeepsie with our surrounding towns, and my fire chief is telling me that maybe it's not an equitable mutual aid. I assume that your software is tracking when we call and when they call.
Yeah.
Yes, we do track all that. It is definitely mutual, especially with Granby. And Granby actually has the same kind of setup as we do. They run 2 ambulances during the day and the one at night. So we both have kind of agreed that this is the model that seems to be working for the Valley very well right now. So basically with Granby and Canton, we have 5 ambulances during the day to cover this surrounding area. But we have been tracking them, how many times we're going out, how many times they come in, and keeping track. It's stayed pretty steady. Even with the second ambulance on during the day, the numbers haven't fluctuated. This just goes to show you how unpredictable call volume is. But we both agree that having the two on during the day is tantamount. And we have spent many days crisscrossing where they come in for us and we go back. But it works. It works really well. The Valley is very fortunate to have that arrangement. You're welcome.
Well, I was gonna try to, I guess Heather has one more question, but I'm trying to cut it off so we can have a break before the next meeting. Okay, no, the only thing I just want to say is, your March 31st date is pretty much in line with, because we're gonna pretty much have our budget decisions, at least on our side, talked about. So I would hope that if it comes to that, we will know by March 31st, which way we're going. And again, we also have the MOU that's in place. And that would also have to be updated for the next fiscal year, which we talked about when we initiated it. Lee, you good here? Done with the meeting? Do you have any?
I would like to emphasize that we look forward to your feedback, particularly between now and the time that Mark presents the recommended budget at the end of February. Feedback for him, because he may or may not include this in the budget. And secondly, if there's any additional information that you would require for the budget review period, please let us know. We have provided a lot of information, but as Karen indicated, there is more. So if you need more, please let us know. We will provide it.